Good evening. Welcome to the Bible Speaks Today from LBC Television Ministries. I'm Tony Baxter, and if you didn't know that, you weren't watching the credits, obviously, but I am for my sins. We are in the last, and to stop cheering, we're in the last program on the series Women in the Church, and whilst I realize that some of the discussions over the past 2 or 3 weeks have been somewhat tortuous, because we've been going into, well, the Greek says this and it means that and this sort of thing. But sometimes to get to what the man actually said is difficult, but it needs to be done, because so very often we hang our hats, both theologically and personally and everything, on a misunderstanding of a term. And if you don't think that is true, then you need to follow the discussions in the press and on TV and the internet and everywhere else on the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Because if you read it one way, we all should be armed to the teeth, okay? And if you read it another way, if we're not in the government or the army or the police or some sort of authorized militia unit, we shouldn't be armed to the teeth, okay? And it depends on your viewpoint or how you understand this and that and everything else. And that argument's been going on for a goodly number of years, okay? And it's the same with our Bible quotations. As I said last week, it's, to me personally, and I make this point several times during the year in these programs, but the commentaries and the comments made on this program are mine. They may reflect, in some instances, what the church who houses this ministry believes, but not necessarily. In fact, on the front of the tape, you don't see this, but we put on the front of our DVD, there is a disclaimer that says that these views are not the views of whoever's playing the DVD, Insight Cable or whoever, and at the end of it, we say the same thing. Because people don't want to say, oh, we're putting this out and that's what we believe. They say, hey, you're putting it out, it's your particular view. And in my case, what I put out on this program is what I personally believe or what I adhere to. Now, you may not, and in fact, I know from some of your emails, a lot of you do not agree with what I say. Now, most of you are just beg to differ, and I understand that. And it could be, as I get older, although that's not going to happen too much longer, if you know what I mean, that I may change my mind on some subjects and learn more about it and think, no, I was wrong. That's the beauty of education and study and this sort of thing. Something you thought was carved in stone has revealed itself to be not quite what it should be. Now, I don't mean to say that your faith should be constantly changing, but there are certain things that happen. I mean, for example, if we dug up something in Qumran or something again which showed a later translation or a later copy of one part of the Bible, then we'd be perhaps have to look at that and see how it compared with what we'd been understanding up to today, But again, as far as women in the church, and we are going to get to a conclusion today, I promise. I think once you see that the weakness of the traditional view of women, church-wide, okay? Once you see that, once you agree that, yes, women are not more prone to emotion, they're not more prone to deception, they're not more prone to being led astray, this sort of thing, than anybody else. I mean, you only got to look at church history, see how many women fly-by-nights there were, if you like. I think Amy McPherson, was one, but there's a lot more men than that in recent times. Swaggart and Baker and one or two others, okay? So, it works both sides of the aisle, as they say. Okay, but once you've understood the weakness of women, once you've said, okay, we understand that women aren't weak, then you've got to look at and say, well, what is your view of the role of women? What should it be? Okay, I mean, I could talk for hours about that, and I'm sure I'd get guests in here and everyone would have a different point of view. But I think what I'm going to try and do this evening to close is indicate a general feeling on this, okay? You know, certainly of my thinking anyway. We've dealt fairly successfully, I think, with the passages used by the male-only interpreters. You know, we've been dealt with. You know, we've discussed them. We've said, you know, you're hanging your hat on one verse, which doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means, and in fact we've shown that it means something quite different. It's temporary, not permanent. Okay, and we've discussed why Paul said this and why Paul said that, and then we've shown what God intended. And I think God's use of Deborah in Judges is a perfect example of saying, yeah, if you've got to deal with a problem, deal with it, but that's not how it's got to be for the ages. Okay? So we should look perhaps on the positive side of things. Okay? You know, and I'm going to, this is where I open up the can of worms, because I know this isn't going to go down well. But I believe, and so do many other scholars, much more qualified than I, women served in the New Testament church as deaconesses. Now hold the tar and feathers, please. Okay, let me finish. Okay. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 11, if you've got your Bible there, go to it. All right, 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 11, Paul mentions women, and the word he uses, ganaiki, which is the Greek, okay, in connection with the office of deacon. Plain and simple. Now, there is, of course, everything is debatable, and there's some debate about whether he's referring to female deacons or to the wives of deacons. Okay? You got the chapter, you got the verse. Okay, good. There's two reasons why we should think the reference means female deacons. First of all, if Paul was concerned about the qualification of deacons' wives, would he not be even more concerned about the qualifications of elders' wives? Yet he doesn't give any explanation about the wives of elders in the passage. So it seems to me that he's, the best explanation I can find is he's referring to deaconesses in verse 11 rather than to deacons' wives. In the case of female elders, they're not mentioned. And why? Because I think female leadership hasn't been thought about. He's not thinking about that in as far as church goes. All right? Don't forget, Paul was a product of his time. Okay? Now, we'll see later on that Paul used women extensively. In fact, to the point where I think women followers of Paul were more effective than the men for quite considerable time. But he still was a product of his time. His church, or the church services, or the way Paul structured, I mean, let's be honest, the way we worship today is based in no small amount on Paul's direction to his churches on how they should worship. And his direction, his knowledge, you do what you know, okay? You learn from experience. We all do. If you've built a house yourself, I never have, but if you have, then the next house you build, you trade on the experiences you did in the first one and think, we're not going to do that again, we're going to do this way. Quicker, smaller, faster, whatever. Paul's experience in church was based on the Jewish synagogue. So early church procedures, the way they did things, was based a lot on the early churches, on the synagogues. The Christian church, after all, a lot of the early church were Jews who'd converted to Christianity. Of course, a lot of them weren't. A lot of them, certainly in Corinth, Ephesus, places like that, were Gentiles. who had no knowledge of the church and didn't even have a knowledge of how it should be. So Paul provided them with a structure. Okay, and in the Jewish synagogue, the women were kept separate. They worshipped in a separate part. Didn't mean to say they weren't as effective, but they worshipped in a separate part. Okay? But anyway, he didn't mention female elders because it was not thought that there would be female leaders. And if that's true, it squares with his position on leadership in the church. Okay? It seems to me that Paul, how can I say this? Paul felt at the time that it was not the rule for women to be in a submissive role in the home. Okay? And I think he thought more of it as a partnership. But I think he also felt that it was okay for them to change hats and become a leader, and in Paul's case, at the highest level in the church. Okay, but I think at some point he anticipated or thought that the women, even though they were leading men, the women leaders would be under the oversight of the elders. I think that's where Paul's coming from. So if you like, women can lead in a church, can teach this sort of thing, but there was a male over the top. I suppose that happens today, really. We have women who teach in Sunday school, women who run music programs, women who run youth programs, women TV directors. We haven't got one here yet, but we're working on that. Then the pastor, obviously, of the church has the sort of the final say-so. Okay? So the problem with all that, it sounds very interesting, Okay, so Paul says women can teach and lead, but, they shouldn't be under the elders. The problem there is we have a difficult question as to what was the role of a deacon in the New Testament church. Okay? We could talk about this for ever and ever. We're not going to, but if you think about it, in my view, and I'm deviating from my script here because I made a little note to myself, so the control room is going to go crazy now because I'm not sticking to the script, but I believe that the people chosen by the early church and the leaders, the apostles, to serve the women and the children, and we call them deacons, okay, were just that, to serve the women and the children. In other words, to take care of the day-to-day needs. They were not intended to run the church. That was the apostles' job, or after them, the elders. It is my personal belief, and I may be at loggerheads with some of my fellow deacons, but it is my personal belief that deacons should not run a church. They should provide a service to the church, providing for the needs of the members. Now in Timothy it's women and children because men were self-sufficient, but in these modern times we understand that deacons provide for the elderly, for the sick, for anyone who needs help, right? But they should not be the governing body of the church. Far too many churches elect people to become deacons to become the leaders of the church. Now, different churches run different ways. Some churches have a pastor and staff who run the church. They make the decisions. If they have a major decision to make, they bring it before the church votes on it. Some churches have a team, an advisory council or a leadership team of some sort with members from different groups within the church who administer and manage the different areas of worship and evangelism and fellowship and all this sort of thing, and meet and make the major decisions, including the financial ones. Okay? Other churches have a deacon board who makes all the decisions. Okay? And who wield a great deal of power. I personally do not believe that deacons should wield power within a church. That's my personal opinion. I believe deacons should provide a service within a church. Okay? As I say, different churches disagree with me, but I want to make where I was coming from, right? And the second reason, going back to what we're talking about, women deacons, that gunaki, that word gunaki means women, women specifically. In Timothy 3:11, you got it in front of you, right? Our deacons is that Paul mentions a female deacon specifically in Romans 16:1. Now he's not going against women leading the church, in which he says it shouldn't really happen, right? But he's saying that here's a woman who's a mention of a deacon. Now, again, you've always got the naysayers, and you've got some authors who say that this is an example of the generic use of the word deacon, rather than a specific reference to the office, but there's no good reason for that. There's no reason to suspect that Paul's use of the masculine noun for deacon to refer to a woman indicates he's referring to the office of a deacon. In other words, he's talking about women, but he uses a masculine noun for the word deacon. In other words, a woman is a deacon, right? Therefore, as far as I'm concerned, and of course many others, women held the office of deacon in the New Testament church. But here's the caveat. A position that was important, yes, very important, and authoritative within the limits established by the elders. Now, you can be a very modern church and say women can be anything they want, or you can be a fundamental church that says women, have their place and that sort of thing. But it specifically calls out women deacons, okay? Women prophesied, Paul talks about it, in the church assembly. Women got up and prayed. Women got up and discussed and said, I had a vision, or whatever, prophecy. People have different meanings of prophecy. I think a lot of people think that somebody went into a trance and their eyes rolled back in their head and a lot of gobbledygook came out, and that's not what it is. You can prophesy by discussing or amplifying the Bible, okay? And they did it in public assembly, I'd say, in church. And it's very difficult to see if you say that. If a woman can prophesy, how can they not teach? So therefore, women can teach in church. I mean, that fact alone has got to be a total slap in the face to those people who believe that women are more easily deceived. I mean, being easily deceived would be a tremendous drawback to a prophet, no matter what gift it is, whether it's tongues or speech or analytic conversion or whatever, okay? We know that Paul made extensive use of the service of women, extensive use, and probably included a spoken ministry. It would appear from what Paul talks about, okay, that he sent instructions to the various women who were working for him and said, tell them this, or when you get up in front of the church, talk about this. I mean, we have just a handful of letters from Paul. I cannot believe, and nor do many other scholars believe, that they're the only ones who wrote. They're the only ones we have. They're the only ones that have lasted through time. But I imagine if you were around in AD 60 and 70, the letters from Paul were floating around all over the place. He established more than 2 or 3 churches. He wrote more than one letter to most of them, I'm sure. People wrote letters, as we used to before the advent of the internet and Facebook and all that good stuff, frequently, to keep in touch. And when Paul refers to his fellow workers, or refers to women rather, as his fellow workers, or being outstanding amongst the apostles. Now think about that. When you say somebody is outstanding amongst the apostles, then the assumption is that they're an apostle. He's recognizing their ability to do Christian work. If I said that our chief cameraman here was outstanding amongst race car drivers, then you would assume, quite naturally, that he was a race car driver. Fair enough? Okay? You can't say, oh no, he's not saying that. Yes, he is. Okay? It's very doubtful, given that Paul doesn't seem to heap lots of praise on people very easily, it's very doubtful to assume that Paul would praise somebody's work so much if it was not based on the ministry of the word. I mean, I just don't think he'd say, oh, they're great cooks, they're wonderful deacons, they're wonderful people, you know. The fact that he had women traveling with him, something we forget about, but it's true, and planting churches, it clearly implies that they were, when they spoke, they were doing it with good values, with good background, and with evangelism. I mean, it's difficult to think of Paul recognizing female co-workers in church planting, and at the same time the idea of women being silent in church. It just doesn't happen. I mean, look at Romans 16:7, identified as apostles, that's what it says, right? What truly makes this a real area of debate among scholars is that the second named person in this passage, you know, read 16:7, is quite likely a woman. Okay? And finally, he said, everybody's heaving a sigh of relief. As we've seen in the case of Deborah, God can and will go to female leadership at the highest level, especially if the men are unwilling or unable to get the job done. I mean, look at the missionary field. How many women are out there? A lot, okay? It's often said, now hopefully it's not your church or this church, but it's often said that the loudest voices raised in churches opposing women teaching, leading, being deacons, being anything other than just people who cook meals, are from men who are themselves not effectively serving the needs of the church. As somebody said, you get some stuffed shirt male opposing female ministry because that person is likely to be the first one to be replaced by women when push comes to shove. In the time of Deborah, Barak was deprived of the honor when defeating the Midianites, right? Because he was a coward, all right? I think today many male-only workers in churches will be deprived of the, if you like, the honor of defeating the devil if they protect their right to do nothing or very little at the expense of women who want to serve. I think a lot of churches today, and I'm quoting this gentleman here, which is kind of interesting, he says, they hobble around on one foot because they are unwilling to give women their rightful role as competent, hard-hitting Christian workers. Okay? God made us equal. Okay? And so I believe we should hold out, all of us, that women are able to undertake the full function of church workers as co-workers. I mean, we're in a terrible struggle against the devil, and yet we're fighting with one arm tied behind our back. Why on earth would we not utilize the strength and the depth of emotion in women, both as deacons, both as ministers? Why can't a woman be a minister? Okay? It's preaching the same thing, same Bible. It's not coming out with oh, this is a woman's Bible, it's different to yours. You know, now, of course, there's charlatans in every profession. We have enough of those in the Christian faith. Some of them have been women, sure they have. A whole bunch more have been men. Okay? If you've got a church of 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 members, probably 30, 40% of those members are women. Are you willing to let 40% of your church idle because of some male-only dogma that trends back to a misunderstanding of one passage, one verse in Scripture that was addressing a problem within a church and not as a standard, this is the way it's going to be? Anyway, Think about that. Some of you, I'm sure, are going to say, oh, well, we're always like that. You know, we've always felt that way, and I'm glad of that. But there are probably a whole horde of would-be deacons, of would-be ministers, of would-be missionaries, would-be church leaders, whatever, out there in churches that are repressed and held back because of this outmoded idea that women should be silent and not teach. Perish the thought. Okay, that's the end of that little series. I'm sure you're going to have some comments. I've got a couple of ideas for the next few weeks. I'm not going to tell you what they are in case you write to me and tell me not to do them. Okay? But until then, keep your Bible handy. Try and understand what it says to us, all right? Just remember that we're in a constant battle against evil, and we need to be vigilant, okay? Till then, good night. God bless.